China's property market was once the world's most powerful money machine. It built entire skylines, lifted millions into the middle class, and fueled 3 decades of unstoppable growth. But today, that same machine has turned into a black hole, swallowing trillions of dollars, bankrupting developers, and leaving behind ghost cities and shattered dreams. Welcome to China Panorama. In today's investigation, we dive deep into China's property collapse, from money machine to black hole. For years, real estate in China was not just an industry. It was the backbone of the entire economy. At its peak, housing and construction made up nearly 1/3 of China's GDP, an astonishing figure no other major country could match. Buying a home was seen as the ultimate path to wealth, security, and even social status. Developers like Evergrande, Country Garden, and Sunac rose to become global giants, selling millions of apartments, many of them before they were even built. Investors poured money into property, families stretched their savings, and local governments relied on land sales to fund everything from highways to schools. But behind this miracle was a dangerous bubble. Prices soared far beyond what ordinary families could afford. Developers borrowed heavily, piling up trillions of dollars in debt. And local governments became addicted to the property boom, selling land at inflated prices just to keep the machine running. By 2021, cracks began to show. When Evergrande defaulted on more than $300 billion in debt, the illusion of endless growth shattered. The property sector, once the pride of China's economy, became its biggest liability. Since then, the crisis has only deepened. Home prices have fallen by over 14% since 2021. Sales have collapsed by double digits, and hundreds of projects across the country stand abandoned, half-finished skeletons of concrete, reminders of broken promises. But beyond numbers and statistics, there's the human story. Millions of families paid for apartments that may never be delivered. Couples who saw housing as their future now face financial ruin. Entire cities are filled with empty towers, eerie ghost neighborhoods where grass grows through cracked pavement. And then comes the fraud. In the chaos, scammers and struggling developers have turned desperation into a business model. They lure buyers with steep discounts on unfinished apartments, promising delivery that may never come. These so-called empty shell scams leave ordinary citizens holding worthless contracts, while the developers vanish with the cash. What was once the dream of homeownership has become a nightmare for millions. Why does this matter to the rest of the world? Because China's property market isn't just domestic, it's global. The collapse is already hitting commodity exporters like Australia and Brazil, who relied on Chinese demand for steel, iron ore, and cement. It's shaking international investors who hold billions in Chinese developer bonds. And it's weakening China's role as the engine of global growth. For more than 2 decades, China's property boom seemed unstoppable. Cities rose from farmland in a matter of years. Tower blocks filled the skylines of Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. Even small towns built grand residential complexes, often far larger than the population could sustain. The Chinese government introduced the 3 red lines policy in 2020 to rein in excessive borrowing. Developers who crossed debt thresholds were cut off from new financing. That policy was meant to cool the bubble, but instead, it triggered a chain reaction. Suddenly, cash-starved developers couldn't finish construction. Projects froze, buyers panicked, and the giant Evergrande, with $300 billion in liabilities, became the first domino to fall. The fallout was swift. Across China, entire neighborhoods became ghost towns. Half-built towers stand silent, wrapped in rusting scaffolding. Streets are lined with dark, empty windows, apartments that were sold but never completed. For families who invested their life savings, the pain is devastating. Imagine paying for a home you'll never live in. Imagine carrying a mortgage for 20 years, only to see your dream house turn into an abandoned shell. That's the reality for millions of Chinese households. And the damage spreads beyond individuals. Local governments, which once thrived by selling land to developers, suddenly saw their revenues collapse. Construction jobs disappeared. Related industries, from steel to cement to home appliances, saw demand evaporate almost overnight. When markets collapse, opportunists appear. And China's property crisis has become fertile ground for fraud. One of the most notorious schemes is known as the empty shell scam. Here's how it works. Developers advertise apartments at steep discounts, often 20% or even 30% below market prices. They promise quick delivery or luxury upgrades to lure in desperate buyers. In reality, the buildings don't exist, or the projects are already abandoned. Families hand over their life savings for contracts that are essentially worthless. The developers pocket the cash, stall construction, and often disappear. In many cases, entire projects have been marketed multiple times, sold to different buyers who each believed they were securing the same unit. When the scam unravels, it's ordinary citizens who pay the price. This wave of scams is more than just financial crime. It's a death blow to public confidence. In China, homeownership is not just about shelter. It's about status, security, and a path to middle-class life. For decades, the unwritten rule was that property values only went up. Real estate was seen as the safest bet in a country where other investment options were limited. But now that trust is broken. A UBS survey found that most Chinese citizens believe housing prices will keep falling. Instead of buying, people are waiting. Instead of investing, they're saving. This shift in psychology is paralyzing the market even further, creating a vicious cycle of decline. Some economists describe China's property market as operating like a Ponzi scheme. Developers relied on new buyers to fund old projects. As long as demand kept rising, the cycle continued. But once sales slowed, the entire system collapsed. The comparison is brutal but not far-fetched. The Evergrande case revealed how new down payments were being used to cover interest payments on old debts. Once confidence vanished, the scheme unraveled at lightning speed. The property bubble's collapse has exposed not just weak foundations, but outright fraud. And it has transformed the housing dream into a nightmare for millions. But the story doesn't end there. Because even as Beijing tries to rescue the sector, it faces three structural traps: oversupply, demographics, and household debt that no bailout can solve. For decades, China's real estate sector was hailed as the money machine. It was the golden ticket for families, investors, and the government itself. Ordinary citizens poured their life savings into apartments, not just to live in, but as a way to secure wealth. Developers promised high returns, banks offered easy loans, and local governments reaped enormous profits from land sales. From the late 1990s to the mid-2010s, the sector grew at a breakneck pace. Skyscrapers rose from empty farmland. Ghost cities with shining towers appeared overnight. For the middle class, property ownership wasn't just a financial decision. It was a cultural necessity tied to marriage, status, and family honor. Parents saved every yuan to buy homes for their children, believing real estate was the safest investment. But beneath the glittering skyline, cracks were forming. The model was unsustainable. Developers relied heavily on debt, borrowing from banks, shadow lenders, and even homebuyers who paid up front for apartments that hadn't been built yet. Local governments became addicted to selling land at inflated prices to balance their budgets. The money machine wasn't fueled by productivity or innovation, but by endless borrowing and speculation. By the 2020s, the machine began to break down. Demand slowed, debt ballooned, and unfinished projects spread across the country. The dream of guaranteed wealth was turning into a nightmare of empty buildings, broken promises, and angry homeowners. What was once China's greatest economic engine had now become its biggest liability. When China's property bubble started to burst, the fallout spread like a shockwave across every corner of society. What was once a money-making machine, fueling the dreams of millions, suddenly became a black hole devouring wealth, stability, and trust. The property sector in China makes up nearly 30% of the nation's GDP when you include construction, home furnishings, and financial services tied to housing. So when developers like Evergrande, Country Garden, and Sunac collapsed under the weight of their debts, the entire economy felt the hit. Local governments, heavily reliant on land sales to fund their budgets, suddenly lost their golden goose. Without this revenue, They struggled to maintain public services and infrastructure projects. Banks, already exposed through massive loans to developers, were left holding trillions of yuan in bad debt. While Beijing forced state-owned banks to roll over loans, the financial strain was impossible to hide. Ordinary citizens who had invested their life savings in unfinished apartments found themselves with nothing but debt and anger. The social impact has been devastating. Families who once believed owning property was the safest and smartest investment in China are now facing financial ruin. Homebuyers staged protests in cities across the country, refusing to pay mortgages on homes that were never completed. The frustration has also spilled into the streets. From Zhengzhou to Guangzhou, footage of angry citizens chanting for their money back has gone viral online. These acts of defiance are rare in China, where public dissent is tightly controlled, but the property crisis has touched too many lives to silence. For the Chinese Communist Party, the property collapse is not just an economic crisis, it is a political time bomb. Beijing has long relied on rising housing prices to maintain public confidence. The promise was simple: buy property, watch its value grow, and trust the system. That promise has now been broken. President Xi Jinping has called for common prosperity, but instead of prosperity, many citizens are experiencing financial despair. The growing distrust in local governments, banks, and even the central leadership has shaken the very foundation of the party's social contract with its people. The ripple effects extend far beyond China's borders. Foreign investors who poured money into Chinese real estate bonds have suffered massive losses. Countries that exported raw materials like iron ore and copper to fuel China's property boom now face falling demand. Global markets, once addicted to China's growth, are suddenly confronted with the reality of its slowdown. In short, the collapse of China's property sector is not just a financial story. It is a human story of broken dreams, political risk, and a global economy learning the hard way that China's miracle was built on shaky ground.